how much I valued meetings, weirdly enough, and that I used to really come alive in staff meetings.
You know, something is wrong when meetings are a highlight of your day. Welcome to Living Unconventionally, a podcast about brave people who imagined a new world for themselves and then went out and built it in reality. I'm your host, Chris Piak. Today we talk to Eric Molinsky, the creator of the Imaginary Worlds podcast. Eric shares his journey from being an unhappy animator sitting in a cubicle in LA to becoming one of the best storytellers in modern radio. This will be wonderful. Come on. When I ask myself, what's so special about you? Why I'm personally such a big fan of your podcast. The first thing that I realized was that whenever I hear an episode of your podcast, no matter what it's about, I'm able to completely get lost in the story. And for 25 minutes or 30 minutes, I forget everything around me, my work, the screaming kids, and I can just get lost and I go on a mini vacation with you. I was wondering, what do you think yourself? Is this a talent or a skill of yours?
Oh, thank you. Well, I think it's probably a bit of both. You know, as you probably know, as I've talked about on the podcast, I used to work in animation. I went to a college called CalArts, which is short for the California Institute of the Arts outside Los Angeles, because otherwise the acronym would be CIA and nobody was comfortable with that. So they call it CalArts. You know, I remember I was so happy when I was making these short little animated films, very short, like 90 seconds or 2 minutes, because I used to say I felt like I was designing a piece of time. And then when I went and started working in the animation industry, I felt like I was sort of like on a factory floor. I didn't have that feeling that I had. You know, I really had lost it. And so I was wondering how to get it back. And should I start to try to make short animated films? And you certainly could make a living at that. And this was before computers were as good as they are now. And then when I eventually decided to totally switch careers and go into public radio, my feeling was that I loved shows where they did that. The idea that you could design a piece of time, you know, that you hand it to somebody and say, here, press play. And then you watch them, you know, with my animated films, you know, as short as they were, you could see them hit the moments, you know, when they're supposed to laugh, they laugh. If they go, oh, they go, you know, that's the moment you hope it would happen. And so the idea that you could sort of, like I said, design this piece of time and press play and hopefully everybody would experience what you wanted them to experience was something I was always really fascinated by. You know, I took a class on Hitchcock once in college, and that's something also that fascinated me about Hitchcock was that he was so good at using point of view shots and stuff like that to always put you in the head of the character. And that was his goal, was he said, you know, anywhere in the world, I want you to be able to watch a Hitchcock, he would say, you know, a Hitchcock film and react exactly the moment I want you to. And years after I'm gone, they'll still work. And I always found that an incredibly fascinating concept. So I'm really glad that it works for you, especially because I'm, you know, when it comes to podcasts, I sometimes will start playing a podcast while I'm doing the dishes, then I'll stop. And there are only certain podcasts that I'll be done with the dishes and I'll just go and just sit down on the couch and keep listening to it and at least get to a point where I think I could pause because I'm so wrapped up in the story. And
that's very different. I stopped washing dishes to listen to the podcast.
But yeah, I was about to say that's what I aim to. That's what I aim to accomplish, certainly.
That's quite a huge change. I mean, you mentioned you were an animator. You worked in LA. You invested a lot of time to learn the skills. You went to university, then you worked in animation. In 2004, your employer let your whole department go and you were out of a job. And the thing that I was wondering when I heard this in your podcast, when you talked about this, was this fact that you needed to change your life and go into a new direction. Was this the reason that you decided to do something new? Or was it just that you finally had an excuse to do what you wanted to do?
Yeah, and that's a good point. I finally had an excuse. I often wonder if I would have had the courage. You know, there was a little bit like, you know, the expression golden handcuffs? It's
yeah.
Yeah, it was a little bit
They're
like
called wedding rings.
Oh, haha, that's funny. But yeah, that job was a little bit like the golden handcuffs, you know, that it was a nice cushy job, paid well, and it's the kind of company that people thought they were going to stay at for a very long time, very respectable company. I was yearning to leave and maybe even start a new career. And I think I probably would have eventually, but I don't know if I would have had the guts at that moment to just flat out quit. And it took me a year to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I did a lot of these sort of tests that you take, these sort of self-help tests of what are you really happy doing creatively. And for a while I thought it might be screenwriting. And it took a while for me to finally realize that what do I do well and what would be the best use of my talents. And
Hmm.
so it was actually 2003. I think I may have misspoken in the podcast. I was let go in 2003, and it wasn't until 2004 that I finally came to that realization.
If I put you back into this time, 2003, before you were let go, and let's imagine this is a parallel universe, some idea that you're completely unfamiliar with, of course.
And certainly not something I've ever thought about at all.
No, totally strange. Imagine you wouldn't be fired. If you would have to make a guess, how many years would you have gone on before something would have changed?
Mm. Yeah, so the studio keeps going. How long will I stay? Right now it's 2003. I would guess probably another at least 2 years, I
Hmm.
would say. I would guess.
And do you think you would have ended up where you ended up finally?
I don't know. It's a good question. It's possibly. I think what helped at the time was that I met a woman at a wedding who lived in Massachusetts, and we started dating long distance.
Not the
So
bride, yeah.
not the bride, no. Yes, I'm a homewrecker, and so that kind of helped to some extent in sort of moving that along, even though that it turned out it didn't work out. It turns out sometimes some relationships are better long distance. That sort of helped it along. But yeah, I think it would probably be about 2 years. And then would I end up where I am now? Probably because, I ended up here because my father had a friend who worked at Boston. I'm from Boston originally, worked for Boston Public Radio Station. He said, if you want to get into public radio, why don't you go meet my friend Kathleen? So I went over there and, took the tour. This would have happened either in the parallel universe or this universe. The difference, though, is that we ran into a guy there who is a very, very well-known guy now in our field who's on This American Life named Sean Cole. I don't know if 2 years later Sean would still be in Boston because I think he eventually moved to New York. And he was the one who said to me, here's my advice, pick your favorite show, contact them, say you want to be an intern, just bite the bullet and not have to get paid very much, but make yourself indispensable for them and make it so that they just kind of fall in love with you and can't imagine the office running without you. And eventually they'll want to give you a job there. And it was great advice. That is exactly what I did. My favorite show was Studio 360, which was a arts and culture show hosted by a journalist named Kurt Anderson out of New York. So that's what I did. I don't know if I would have run into Sean 2 years later and he would have given me that advice.
It seems on the first look, such a drastic change to go from such a really visual devotion as an animator to something where pictures play no role at all.
Yes, you're not the first person to notice that. Actually, when I first moved to New York, and people were like, who are you? What's your, you sort of tell people your story. A couple people would. I remember there'd be this aha moment where this light bulb would go off, and they'd say, wait, what? You went from this totally visual medium to audio? So it's funny. I had to sort of almost get my. It's something I talked about on my episode about how origin stories, how you have your story you tell people, and I had a totally different story as to why I wanted to be an animator, which was not a great story, frankly. It was that I loved movies, I loved to draw, therefore this must be what I should be doing. I feel like one of the reasons, when I was taking these tests of these class, what were these books called? I'm trying to remember. The Artist's Way.
Tests.
Yeah. There was a book called The Artist's Way that I took, and there was a couple others similar, sort of what color is your parachute and those kinds of things. About what is it that what do you like doing? What could you imagine yourself doing? And I realized how much communication was important to me, how much talking to other people was important to me, how much I valued meetings, weirdly enough, and that I used to really come alive in staff meetings, and I started to notice. I remember when I was taking these tests, how the people that were really getting ahead in animation, you get to a certain level, and you're all actually a fairly similar skill set. I was definitely not as good as a lot of those other people. I mean, it's one of those things where you may be the best artist in your high school, and then you go to Los Angeles and start working in the animation industry, and it's a rude awakening. Much like every actor in Los Angeles, you feel like was probably the best looking kid in their high school, and then went to Los Angeles. And I noticed that the best people were not even necessarily the best artists as much as the people who truly loved sitting in a cubicle 50 hours a week or even 60 hours a week and doing nothing but drawing. And I remember when they canceled our meetings once because the artists were complaining too many meetings, and all meetings would happen one-on-one with your director, scheduled whenever you want. Everybody was so excited because they had more time to spend in their cubicles drawing. And to me, I remember I was the only one who was so depressed that we were losing all of our meetings because I just felt like I craved speech so much.
Human interaction.
Human interaction. And so I started listening to public radio obsessively. I felt like I was living vicariously through public radio. And I also, like I said, I once you get to that level, I just started to realize I just simply did not think visually automatically like other people did. When I would try to brainstorm ideas, I noticed how often I had to start writing it out and writing until I had finally something I was happy with, and I'd draw what I had described to myself, as opposed to the other people who their creative process began with drawing and ended with drawing. It was like that is how they discover things, was through drawing. And these sort of things made me think, I think I'm in the wrong career. It's something that looked good from the outside, but then I never really thought about what is it like to actually do this? What is your job? And so I started thinking of what would I really like to be doing, and talking to people all the time, especially people that I didn't know, who interested me, who did interesting things, who didn't, spend all their time sitting in a cubicle as I was. Even though I was in a cubicle on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood, which is cool, I was still in a cubicle all day.
I'm a business coach, and I coach people who want to build a new life for themselves and change their career. And I speak to a lot of people who tell me, hey, I don't know what I should do. Now, I want to do something different, but I don't know what it is. My thesis is people actually know what they want, even if it's not exactly clear how this will work out, but they need time to work themselves through their fear of change. So now I ask you, how do you see that? What's your view on that?
Well, it's funny. It's like so many times in life I hear, this is what most people think in terms of like, this is normal. And I'm like, well, once again, I feel like I'm not clearly not normal. It was totally the opposite for me. I was so that vague feeling of I'm not happy doing this, but what should I be doing? And what I should be doing is something weird and murky. And I couldn't figure out for a long time what it was. And is this right? And I think on top of that, moving from Boston to Los Angeles, I think they're probably two of the most opposite cities you can almost think of, assuming you're skipping over like the Bible Belt, in terms of just the layout and the kind of people. And I think that I never really quite got over the culture shock of moving from the sort of far East Coast to the far West Coast of the US. So I think on that level, there was a part of me that was already primed to leave. And I also tend to be the kind of person that when I do realize I want something, I probably go too far the opposite. I'm like, I just leap into the pool. And I remember like when I gave this whole plan to my father and told him what I was going to do, it almost reminded me of like The Graduate. There was some line where Dustin Hoffman explains what he wants to do to his father after college. And his father says, Benjamin, this seems very half-baked. And he says, no, it's fully baked. And that was kind of how that conversation went. He's like, what are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about that? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm going to figure it out when I get there. New York, here I come. That's just my personality. Because once I finally felt like I had a direction to go in, then I can run in that direction. But it was, I hated that kind of existential angst of that vague feeling, that thing I couldn't put my thumb on. And I remember this moment when I finally realized, hey, this actually makes sense. And I thought it over for a few days and I was like, I like this. And then I was at a party with a bunch of my former animators and they're like, how you doing? What are you up to? And I said, I think I'm going to quit animation, move to New York and work in public radio. And it was amazing how many of them said, you know what? That makes a lot of sense for you.
Wait, there's more. In a moment, we get Eric Molinsky back on the line. Right now, it's time for a short promo. But before I do that, I just want to get one thing off my chest. I love Eric's podcast, Imaginary Worlds. If you are longing for something beautiful, something that in equal part is kind in spirit and well crafted, check out Imaginary Worlds right here where you are listening to my show. You also find Imaginary Worlds on Eric's website, imaginaryworldspodcast.org. That said, I would like you to meet Shannon.
I would really like to come out of this 30 minutes feeling a bit more confident about how to approach hiring managers online, get them to want to share their company's problems with me.
The gods really have a weird sense of humor. Shannon moved from New Zealand to Germany a few weeks back. Her plane had barely touched the ground when coronavirus arrived in Germany. How do you find a job in a foreign country if you cannot leave the apartment? In my day job, I am a business coach. I work exclusively with international professionals. I help them to find a job in a foreign country. My clients are well educated, but they don't speak the local language. Their university degree is from a college that no one in Germany has ever heard of, and they are all alone in a foreign place. Nobody will recommend them. And yet, I have helped over 100 international professionals to find their next job in Europe. In the next episode of Living Unconventionally, I let you eavesdrop into a coaching call. I will help Shannon to figure out how you get a job in a foreign country when you cannot leave the apartment. Subscribe to Living Unconventionally so that you don't miss this episode. If you are out of a job or you want to start a fresh life in a foreign country, I'm sure I can help you. You can book a coaching session with me at livingunconventionally.com/coaching. Let's get back to Eric Molinsky. Eric is about to share the moment when he finally understood where his true passion lies. And I am about to completely embarrass myself just because I got embarrassed that I showed how I really truly felt. Enjoy. What went through your head when you said that out loud?
Is this crazy? I mean, again, these are all artists, so it's very little they would think is crazy. If I told them I wanted to become an accountant, they'd probably, these are artists in Los Angeles. They'd be like, hey, man, if that's your bliss, if that's where the spirit is moving you, go, if that's where the universe is telling you, go for it. But still, the fact that they all said, so many of them said, oh my God, that is so perfect for you. That is so you. And these are people that are still very much in the industry. It reminded me of when I was at Cal Arts and I would do my animated films. People, when they would compliment me, they'd often say, you're a really good writer. And I get insulted. I'm like, you don't think I'm good an artist or an animator? Like, no, that's fine. I mean, that stuff is fine. It's just your writing is really good. And I always thought that was always like a weird backhanded compliment, but it was one of those things you start connecting the dots. I remember coming away from that party, that reaction to people, and I was like, yeah, that's kind of what I thought. So it took me like a year to figure this out, and then like 3 days to make the decision, of just mulling it over to make sure it's not just some half-baked idea I had out of the blue. And I was like ready to go after that.
You must have been super energized.
Yeah, I was excited. It was a new adventure. And like I said, I think the difference for me is that I also had this, I had been in Los Angeles almost 10 years, and I feel like I felt as much like a fish out of water 9.5 years later than I did when I first arrived.
This is one of my biggest fears, that you continue to do what you feel like you are supposed to do. And then one day you wake up and your life is over. Insurance companies, they have long lists when they can look up your gender and your birth date and can tell you statistically how long you will live. When will be statistically the day that you will die.
Jeez.
And I have a countdown on my website, a final countdown that ticks down the days of life that I still have left. And that's there for myself to remind me what really matters in life. So that I ask myself before I commit to something, is this really worth my time? No? Or would this time be used to play with my children, or to draw something, or to write something, or do something like that? Yeah, I can empathize with this feeling that, okay, I was here for 10 years and it's time to do something different.
Yeah, and it's a feeling of, once I started reaching the 10-year mark, I just thought, okay, am I really committed to this life here? I think also there was a feeling that I had ended up there with choices I made out of college. And I feel like at 22, I didn't know myself very well. And it was kind of, I feel like I was following more of a romantic notion of Hollywood, and just the idea of, being in Los Angeles, being in the film industry, who doesn't go out to Hollywood with those dreams? I felt like the most down-to-earth people that I met there were people who were born in Los Angeles, and some of them whose parents worked in the entertainment industry, and they always just saw it as the local business. They didn't sit in a movie theater hundreds of, thousands of miles away dreaming of Hollywood. They always knew what how this proverbial sausage was made. So I think that's why a lot of people kind of go out there, and I feel like I was making a wiser, more mature decision of, okay, 22-year-old me made this plan, but at 31, with all the life experience I've had, do I still like this plan? The hardest thing for me was leaving my friends behind, because obviously you make a lot of friends at that point. And that was the hardest thing for me. And the thing that I miss the most about working in animation, without question, is the rapport that you have. Animators are fun people. And it was sometimes just the drawings, the silly drawings people would do and put up on a cork board, the jokes that would start to snowball very quickly, was so much fun. And public radio people are really interesting, but it's not quite the same. And then now, when I started my own podcast, it's funny how I moved into radio to do more what I wanted to do and what felt right for me personally. And then I left, and I eventually got like a staff job there at New York Public Radio, and then left again to become a freelancer, and then left again to start my podcast. Like, I just continually this drive to create this career that is so crafted towards me and my talents and how best to express. And I feel like until I started my podcast in 2014, it wasn't until that moment I had finally figured out. And this is, of course, podcasting did not even exist in 2003 when I started thinking this up, of like, how can I best express myself? I truly feel like this podcast is the best expression of me. The downside is, after all that, I'm pretty much home alone during the day.
You ended up where you started.
Yeah, I mean, I communicate with lots of people. It's funny, the main difference with the pandemic now is that I used to walk 10 minutes away to this cubicle I used to rent, ironically. It's a very low cubicle. It's an open office space. And I sort of wished that I knew people better there, but I didn't know many. After years, it's hard to make friends with people in these cubicle spaces when no one's working on the same thing in particular. If anything, I enjoyed the 10-minute walk out there. And if I had someone to interview within New York City, I'd take my equipment and go to their office or their apartment. That was fun. There's probably a couple people I've interviewed in the last 3 months that I would have liked to have been able to interview them in person. Other than that, my job is pretty much the same. So, I mean, that's kind of the funny thing, but the trade-off was definitely worth it, as opposed to the job itself, me being really unhappy and feeling unfulfilled. And yet, boy, do we have a lot of fun joking around at the office at the water cooler.
That's what I was wondering, because now you are in radio for 16 years in total again. And so you definitely know how the sausage is made. Do you think it was worth it to change?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's funny because sometimes too, you also don't have much control over what you do in animation. I mean, my dream was to work at Pixar. And I remember a friend of mine who worked at Pixar, and I don't know, it was a friend of a friend was talking to me about it. And he said, it's the same job. If you hate your job now, yeah, you get to work at Pixar, but you're literally doing the same thing. He's like, and also, I don't know how you're going to get to Pixar if you're not showing a great love of the craft itself. The people, you could end up on some terrible show because you don't have much control. You just want to work. And everybody who got let go in where I worked, some of them ended up on shows that I would have been happy to work for, like Family Guy. And some of them ended up on cartoons that I would have been like, this is the most giant waste of my life ever. I can't believe I'm spending even a single day working on this terrible cartoon. And they thought, you know what? I get to draw for a living. Not my favorite cartoon. Would have been great to work for Pixar. But hey, I get to work in animation. Isn't that great? And they said those are the people Pixar's looking for, that they can make lemonades out of lemons because they have such a passion. And I remember thinking this makes so much sense, because I remember it's the equivalent of moving into public radio and saying, I only want to work for Ira Glass. And if I can't work for Ira Glass, I will have wasted my life. If somebody was to say that to me, I'd say, I think you're in the wrong career, because you're probably not going to get on This American Life. Sorry.
What I would like to talk with you about is the things that helped you getting this done. And we touched on this a little bit already. And also maybe the difficulties you had. I have a feeling that people play quite a role in that. Is that correct?
It was actually my brother was the one who suggested it to me. I was describing to him how I was taking these sort of tests of creativity, and this is what it says. This is what I want, and I want something like this. And he was the one who first suggested public radio. He said, you listen to public radio all day long. You live like vicariously through it. Like, why don't you just do it? And that said, my brother has often given me lots of advice I've totally ignored, or advice that I took and realized later, why did I listen to my brother about that? So it's not like my brother's always, I mean, we have a great relationship, but it's not like, oh, Andy, if you always give me advice, I know it's right. But this one just absolutely, completely fit. It was one of those light bulb kind of moments. Mm-hmm. And if he hadn't suggested that, I don't know. I don't know how long it would have taken.
In one of your episodes, your father is there and he's talking about how you used to looking out.
Yeah.
So he might not have been very surprised by your wish, or.
Yeah, I mean, he was, parents too, it's always about stability as well. And I think that when I was in the time between that year that I left or was let go of animation, he wanted me to be pounding the pavement to find another job, in a studio, which is a steady office job. And and I was taking a bunch of screenwriting classes and I was taking improv classes, and it felt like very much like a dilettante kind of thing to do. I was getting tremendously good unemployment benefits because California has fantastic, or had fantastic. I don't know if it's still that way, unemployment. So it allowed me some lead time to figure that out until the unemployment ran out. And I was like, that was also it too. I think that there was a sense of, I have this many months until the unemployment runs out for me to kind of explore and decide, do I want to get another job in animation or not? So that I think gave me a bit of a cushion as well, and an internal deadline at the same time.
And then you mentioned you got introduced to someone at radio. I'm sorry, I'm from Germany, so I'm not familiar with all people in American radio.
Oh, that's fine. I mean, most people here. In fact, in my class, I play this guy a lot, and I say he's the most famous person you've never heard of. But if you listen to a lot of these shows, you've heard his voice because he appears on everything. So yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, that's one thing that I liked about radio always. That it's very intimate, which I love. Mm-hmm. And people recognize your voice, but they don't know your face.
Yeah.
So you can have fame if you want to, but if you want your privacy, you simply shut your mouth, and then it's good.
Yeah.
At your first radio station where you worked, you also had some kind of mentor that helped you to grow, if I understood this correctly.
Yeah. There's a guy named David Krasnow. He is now the executive producer of a show called the New Yorker Radio Hour, which is the New Yorker magazine sort of radio show. It's a very good public radio show. But he was the editor for a long time, and he's very good at, he happens to have a very good knack and enjoys the process of finding people who are new to radio and helping train them, because he himself was a print journalist who covered the arts in print and made a transition that felt rocky to him, I think, because he didn't have a mentor. He had to learn everything the hard way, and there was just some spark in him that just said, I want to make sure other people don't have the same mistakes I made. But then also, I think he was kind of fascinated by the lessons that he had learned. I even brought him in to talk to my class last year, and I can tell he still loves enjoying telling people about what he discovered, when moving from print journalism to radio. And he was incredibly forgiving of the mistakes I made early on, because I did not come from print journalism. I came from animation. And but I also think that, I remember very early on when I was an intern, people liked me, and I certainly tried to make myself very important to them. But I remember there was definitely a suspicion that people had about me as to whether I could do this. Because I had come from animation, I remember there was this feeling of, well, how seriously should we invest in this guy? He's great at running around and getting us coffee or getting us, whatever it is we want him to get us. But do we really give him something important to do?
But that's an attitude that's completely foreign to you, because I listened to an interview that you made with David Barr Kirtley. And somewhere in the interview, you mentioned that, it was so hard. And then I found an editor, and I discovered my wife can be a really good editor, even though she's in TV.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, I boy, she would not like to hear that. But, because I remember once I was saying something about well, you really you can be a really good editor. And she's like, I went to journalism school, don't you? You didn't. I did. Don't give me this just because I worked in TV and not radio. Yeah, it's funny. So, but she worked at TV News. Yeah. But yeah, and then I did my first piece for them. And the funny thing is that the sound design program, which now it's Pro Tools, there was a similar program I used to use called Sound Designer to make the soundtrack for my animated films in college. And I remember I kept thinking of Luke Skywalker saying, this is like bullseyeing womp rats that might take 16 back in Beggar's Canyon. Like it was kind of like I know how to do this. This is the same basic thing. It's like creating the soundtrack to my animated film, but with no pictures. And I remember enjoying using that program when I was at CalArts. I remember once even listening to my film without any pictures just to see whether it could hold up as a radio drama. And I was like, oh, it totally does. And so I put this thing together very quickly, and I remember they listened to it and they just thought, oh my God, like you actually can do this. And I was like, yeah, I've been telling you all this time. And I remember that was the moment they all started taking me much more seriously.
Eric, you built really an incredible success with Imaginary Worlds. And by success, I mean that you created something that I'm sure people will still love, even if they listen to it like 10 years from now. I'm pretty sure in the year, 2040, nobody will snuggle up in the wintertime in the sofa with a blanket and go through 20-year-old annual reports of stock exchange listed companies. But they will listen to your stories.
Thank you. It's something I often think about. Hoping that these things have longevity. But anyway,
that your stories are more interesting than stock listings.
Oh, good. Thank you. I'm very flattered.
And this comes very natural. I used to be a finance journalist after I worked for radio. And for years, all I had to talk about was like 3% up, 2% down, and so on. The point that I was making, or that I wanted to make, was that what you create gives people happiness and will continue to give them happiness. And that's what I think is real success.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that.
If you could give our listeners one piece of advice, those of us who feel they want to change their life, they want to do something different with their life, start a new career or move to a new country. What's the number one thing they should do in order to come one step closer to their goal?
What always helped me too was that there was always this feeling of, and I don't know if this is good advice at all, but there was always this feeling of, if this doesn't work, you can always go back. There was just, it's like when I was little and I used to always be afraid to do anything. And my mother used to always say, if you don't like it, if you don't like this class I've signed you up for or whatever, you don't have to keep going. I'm not going to be one of those parents that's going to be like, you're going to finish this. I signed you up for this 8-week semester thing. She's like, pottery class and you're going to enjoy it. She just was like, if you don't like it, she said, just try it, stay to the end of this first thing. See if you like it. If you don't like it, you never have to go back. And I remember that always helped me try things as a kid. If you don't like this food, you never have to eat it again, but just try it. That's kind of how I felt. Like, I'm going to do this, but don't feel trapped if it doesn't work. Because you never know. I could have gotten to New York and just said, oh my God, Los Angeles is the true love of my life, city-wise, and animation was my true passion. What have I done? And then people would say, hey, did you hear about Eric? He went to New York and moved back 8 months later and he's looking for work. That's okay. That's what helped me throughout the first sort of 6 months or so when I moved here. But then pretty soon I realized I had made the right decision. But it helped me in both ends, both in packing up to leave and make this giant change, and then unpacking and trying to set up a new life here with the sense of like, you haven't killed the old life. It's, if you really want to find a way back, you can.
That's it for this week. Many thanks to Eric Molinsky for sharing his journey with us. I love Eric's podcast, Imaginary Worlds, and I strongly recommend you check it out. If you like to escape for a while and enter a world full of interesting stories and amazing characters, check out Eric's podcast. It's called Imaginary Worlds, and you find it right here where you are listening. You can also go to imaginaryworldspodcast.org, a link to Eric's site in the show notes. One last thing. In the next episode of this podcast, Living Unconventionally, you will meet Shannon. She left her home in New Zealand to start a new life in Germany. And just after she arrived, coronavirus hit Germany. How do you find a job in a foreign country when you cannot leave the apartment? I'm a business coach who specializes in international professionals. In the next episode of Living Unconventionally, I will help Shannon to take the first step to a job in a foreign country. Make sure to subscribe to Living Unconventionally and listen in. I'm your host, Chris Piak. Stay safe.